Before you even press play, before your mind started racing through everything that could go wrong, God had already stepped into your tomorrow. And I need you to hear this, not casually, not passively, but deep in your spirit. What's been keeping you up at night has never caught God off guard. While you've been overthinking, replaying conversations, calculating outcomes, and trying to control what you cannot see, heaven has already moved on your behalf. There is a quiet frustration that comes from feeling like you have to figure everything out. Like if you don't think it through one more time, something will fall apart. Like the weight of your future is sitting on your shoulders. But can I remind you of something sacred? You were never assigned the role of God in your own life. The pressure you're carrying was never yours to hold. And the exhaustion you feel is not from doing too much. It's from trying to control too much. Some of you have turned overthinking into a form of protection. You tell yourself, if I can just prepare for every possible outcome, I won't be hurt again. But what you don't realize is that overthinking is not protecting you. It's imprisoning you. It's imprisoning you. It's stealing your peace, distorting your faith, and making you question what God has already settled. Because when you truly trust that God is handling it, you don't have to mentally rehearse every worst case scenario. God is not asking you to have all the answers. He's asking you to trust that He does. And I know that's hard when you can't see the full picture, when the situation still looks uncertain, when nothing around you has changed yet. But faith was never about having visible proof. It's about having internal certainty. It's about knowing, even in the middle of the unknown, that God is already working behind the scenes. So today, this is your invitation to release the need to control every detail, to let go of the constant mental noise, to stop trying to solve what God has already secured. Because while you've been stressing, God has been stressing, God has been strategizing. While you've been worrying, God has been working. And what feels delayed to you is often God aligning things in ways you could never imagine. Take a breath. Not because everything is perfect, but because everything is already in motion. And the same God who brought you this far didn't forget how to finish what He started. There is a subtle pressure that creeps into your life when you feel like everything depends on you. It doesn't announce itself loudly at first. It shows up in the quiet moments, when you're lying in bed replaying conversations, when you're trying to predict outcomes, when you're calculating every possible scenario just to feel some sense of control. And before you even realize it, you've stepped into a role you were never designed to carry. You've started trying to play God in your own life because somewhere along the way, you convinced yourself that if you don't think about it enough, plan it enough, worry about it enough, something will fall apart. That if you loosen your grip, everything you've worked for will slip through your fingers. So you hold tighter, you analyze harder, you overthink deeper. And what you call responsibility slowly turns into a burden that begins to crush your peace. But can I challenge that belief for a moment? What if the very thing you think is keeping your life together is actually the thing pulling you apart? What if your need to control every detail is not strength, but fear dressed up as wisdom? Because when you feel like you have to manage every outcome, you're not operating from trust. You're operating from anxiety. You were never created to carry the weight of knowing everything, fixing everything, and controlling everything. That position has already been filled. And every time you try to step into it, you end up exhausted, overwhelmed, and disconnected from the very peace God has already made available to you. Because the truth is, control will always demand more from you than you have the capacity to give. And it's not that you don't have faith, it's just that your faith has been competing with your fear. You believe in God, but you also believe that you have to help Him out. You trust Him, but only up to the point where things start to feel uncertain. And when the unknown shows up, your mind goes into overdrive, trying to fill in the gaps that only God was meant to handle. But let's be honest, How many times has your overthinking actually changed the outcome? How many nights have you lost sleep trying to solve something that didn't even turn out the way you imagined? How many times have you carried stress for situations that God already worked out without your mental interference? And yet, the pattern continues because letting go feels unfamiliar and control feels like safety. But control is an illusion. It gives you the feeling that you're doing something when in reality you're just draining yourself emotionally, mentally, and even spiritually. It keeps your hands so full that you can't even receive what God is trying to give you because you can't hold on to control and surrender at the same time. One will always cancel out the other. And this is where the shift has to happen, not in your circumstances, but in your mindset. You have to recognize that releasing control is not losing power. It's aligning with the right source of power. It's understanding that God doesn't need your help to be God. He's not waiting on your overthinking to figure things out. He's not depending on your anxiety to move on your behalf. In fact, some of the delays you're experiencing are not because God isn't working, but because you haven't let go. Because every time you try to take control back, you interrupt the process. You step in where God is trying to step through. And instead of resting in his plan, you start rewriting it with your fears, your doubts, and your limited perspective. You have to come to a place where you trust that God sees what you cannot see, that he understands what you cannot understand, that he is already in places you haven't even arrived at yet. Because if you truly believe that, then you would realize that your role is not to control the outcome, but to trust the one who already holds it. And I know that sounds simple, but it's not always easy because letting go requires vulnerability. It requires you to admit that you don't have all the answers. It requires you to sit in the discomfort of not knowing, but it also opens the door for a level of peace that control could never give you. Because peace doesn't come from having everything figured out. Peace comes from knowing that even when you don't, God does. It comes from resting in the assurance that you are not navigating life alone, that there is a divine hand orchestrating things behind the scenes, aligning moments, shifting circumstances, and making ways that you could never plan on your own. So instead of trying to play God, what if you decided to trust him? What if you released the pressure to have it all together? What if you stopped rehearsing every worst case scenario and started believing that God is already working things out for your good? What if you allowed yourself to breathe again, not because everything is certain, but because God is? Because at the end of the day, control will always leave you tired, but trust will always lead you to peace. And the moment you stop trying to carry what was never yours, you create space for God to move in ways you've been trying to force on your own. Overthinking has a way of disguising itself as wisdom. It whispers to you that if you just think a little longer, analyze a little deeper, and prepare for every possible outcome, you'll be safe. It convinces you that running every scenario through your mind is a form of protection. That if you can just stay one step ahead, you won't be caught off guard, you won't be hurt, you won't be disappointed. And so you sit there turning the same thoughts over and over again, believing that you are guarding your heart, when in reality, you are exhausting your soul, because overthinking doesn't actually protect you. It traps you. It keeps you stuck in cycles of fear, replaying things that have already happened and trying to control things that haven't even come yet. It builds a false sense of control while quietly stealing your peace. And the more you engage with it, the louder it becomes until it feels impossible to silence. You start questioning everything. Conversations that were simple become complicated. Decisions that should be straightforward become overwhelming. You second guess your instincts, your choices, even your worth. And before long, you are no longer living in the present moment. You are living in your mind, caught between what was and what could be, never fully experiencing what is. And the truth is, overthinking is often rooted in fear. Fear of being hurt again. Fear of making the wrong decision, fear of losing something or someone important. So your mind goes into overdrive, trying to anticipate every possible risk, believing that if you can just think it through enough, you can avoid the pain. But what it actually does is keep you in a constant state of anxiety where peace feels distant and rest feels impossible. Because here's what overthinking does. It magnifies uncertainty and minimizes faith. It makes problems seem bigger than they are, and God seems smaller than He is. It shifts your focus from what is possible to everything that could go wrong. And without realizing it, you start trusting your fears more than you trust God. You begin to believe that your ability to think things through is what will save you. That if you just stay alert, stay aware, stay mentally engaged, you can control the outcome. But the reality is, no amount of overthinking can change what God has already ordained. No amount of mental rehearsing can secure what is already in His hands. And yet the habit continues because overthinking feels active. It feels like you're doing something. It gives you the illusion that you're solving a problem even when you're only circling around it. But just because your mind is busy doesn't mean it's being productive. Sometimes it's just being overwhelmed. And that overwhelm begins to show up in every area of your life. You feel drained. Even when you haven't physically done much, you struggle to focus because your thoughts are scattered. You find it hard to rest because your mind won't slow down. And even in moments that should bring you joy, there's a constant undercurrent of worry that keeps you from fully being present. Or what if the very thing you think is protecting you is actually what's hurting you? What if overthinking is not your shield, but your prison? Because protection should bring peace, not pressure. It should create safety, not anxiety. And if your thoughts are constantly leaving you restless, tense, and uncertain, then they are not protecting you. They are draining you. God never asked you to carry that kind of mental weight. He never asked you to figure everything out before you trust Him. He never said you needed to have all the answers in order to have peace. In fact, the kind of peace God offers doesn't come from understanding everything. It comes from trusting Him in the middle of what you don't understand. But that requires a shift. It requires you to recognize when your thoughts are no longer serving you. To catch yourself when you start spiraling into what ifs and maybe this means and what happens if, it requires you to pause and remind yourself that not every thought deserves your attention and not every scenario deserves your energy. Because just because something crosses your mind doesn't mean it's true. Just because it feels real doesn't mean it will happen. And just because you can imagine, it doesn't mean it's part of God's plan for your life. You have to learn how to separate your thoughts from your truth. And your truth is this: God is already aware of what concerns you. He already knows what you're trying to figure out. He has already gone before you, making ways, opening doors, and aligning things in ways your mind could never fully comprehend. And if that is true, then you don't have to keep trying to solve everything in your head. You can release it, not because you don't care, but because you trust. Not because you have all the answers, but because you know the one who does. You can let go of the constant analyzing, the endless questioning, the exhausting mental loops, and choose to rest in the assurance that God is in control. And that doesn't mean your mind will never wander again. It doesn't mean that thoughts won't try to come back, but it does mean that you don't have to entertain them. You don't have to give them power. You don't have to let them dictate your peace. Because peace is not found in overthinking. It's found in surrender. It's found in choosing to trust God even when your mind is trying to pull you in a different direction. It's found in letting go of the need to figure everything out and holding on to the truth that God has already worked it out in ways you cannot yet see. There are moments in your life when everything feels still on the surface, yet everything inside of you is in motion. You're praying, you're believing, you're hoping, but nothing around you seems to reflect that anything is changing. The doors you expected to open remain closed. The answers you've been waiting for feel delayed. The clarity you thought would come by now still hasn't arrived. And in that silence, your mind begins to question, is anything actually happening? Because we've been conditioned to associate movement with visibility. We think that if God is working, we should be able to see evidence of it immediately. We expect clear signs, quick confirmations, obvious breakthroughs. But God doesn't always operate in ways that are visible to the natural eye. In fact, some of his most powerful work happens in places you cannot see, in ways you cannot trace, and on timelines you cannot predict. And that's where the tension begins. Because your faith is being stretched in the gap between what you believe and what you can physically perceive. You're standing in a space where nothing looks different, but everything requires you to trust that something is happening anyway. And if you're not careful, that silence can start to feel like absence. That delay can start to feel like denial. That stillness can start to feel like nothing is working at all. But just because you can't see doesn't mean God isn't working. Just because you don't have proof yet doesn't mean there is no progress. Just because things look the same on the outside doesn't mean something isn't shifting on the inside behind the scenes in ways that will eventually reveal themselves at the right time. God is not limited to what is visible. He is not restricted by what you can measure. While you're focused on what hasn't changed yet, He is working on things you haven't even considered. He is aligning people you haven't met, opening doors you don't even know exist, removing obstacles you didn't even realize were in your path, removing obstacles you didn't even realize were in your path. And all of it is happening beyond your line of sight. But the challenge is that when you can't see it, your mind tries to fill in the blanks. It starts creating its own narratives. It tells you that nothing is happening. It convinces you that you've been forgotten. It makes you question whether your prayers are even being heard. And before long, doubt begins to creep in, not because God has stopped working, but because you've stopped recognizing that He is. You have to understand that God's work is not always loud. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's happening in ways that don't immediately make sense. But that doesn't make it any less real. In fact, some of the most significant shifts in your life are happening in silence, where there are no distractions, no announcements, no immediate evidence, just God moving with intention and precision. Think about how many times in your life things came together in ways you couldn't have planned. Moments where everything aligned perfectly, where doors opened at just the right time, where situations turned around unexpectedly. At the time, it may have seemed sudden, but what you didn't see was everything that had been set in motion long before that moment arrived. That's how God works. He prepares before He reveals. He aligns before He announces. He moves in ways that don't require your awareness in order to be effective. And if you only trust Him when you can see what He's doing, you will miss the depth of His faithfulness in the unseen. Because faith is not about having constant evidence. It's about having consistent trust. It's about believing that even when nothing looks different, something is being developed, something is being positioned, something is being worked out for your good. And I know it's difficult to stay in that place because the waiting can feel uncomfortable. The uncertainty can feel overwhelming. The lack of visible progress can make you feel like you're standing still while everything else is moving forward. But what you have to remember is that just because you feel stuck doesn't mean you are. Sometimes God is working on you while He's working on your situation. Sometimes He's strengthening your patience, deepening your faith, preparing your mindset for what's ahead. Because the blessing you're asking for requires a version of you that is ready to receive it, handle it, and sustain it. So while you're focused on the outcome, God is focused on the process. While you're looking for immediate change, God is building lasting transformation. And while you're waiting for things to shift externally, God is already shifting things internally, making sure that when the moment comes, everything aligns the way it's supposed to. You have to resist the urge to interpret silence as inactivity You have to guard your mind against the lie that nothing is happening, because the truth is God is always working, even when you can't track it, even when you can't feel it, even when you can't understand it. And the moment you truly accept that, something begins to change within you. The pressure to see immediate results starts to fade. The anxiety of not knowing every detail begins to loosen its grip. And you find yourself able to rest, not because everything is clear, but because you trust that God is already handling what you cannot yet see. There is a difference between having faith and trying to manage your life through constant mental rehearsal. And for many people, those two have become so intertwined that it's hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. You say you trust God, but your mind is constantly running through every possible outcome. You declare that you believe things will work out, but you keep preparing yourself for everything that could go wrong. And without realizing it, your faith has been replaced with a cycle of overthinking that feels responsible, but is actually rooted in fear, because mental rehearsal gives you a sense of control. It makes you feel like you are actively engaging with your future. You play out conversations before they happen. You imagine scenarios in advance. You try to predict how people will respond, how situations will unfold, and what you need to do to stay ahead of it all. And while that might seem like preparation, it often becomes a form of anxiety that keeps you trapped in your head instead of present in your life. Faith, on the other hand, does not require you to rehearse every possibility. It requires you to release the need to. It calls you to trust that even if things don't go the way you imagined, God is still in control. It invites you into a space where you are no longer trying to predict every outcome, but instead resting in the assurance that whatever happens, God will sustain you through it. But that kind of surrender is uncomfortable because it asks you to let go of certainty. It asks you to release the illusion that you can control how everything unfolds. And for a mind that has become accustomed to overthinking, that feels risky. It feels like stepping into the unknown without a safety net. It feels like giving up the one thing that has made you feel prepared. Yet what you have to recognize is that constant mental rehearsal is not actually preparing you. It's exhausting you. It's draining your energy, stealing your peace, and keeping you in a state of tension that never fully lets you rest. You're always thinking about what's next, what could happen, what might go wrong. And even in moments that should feel calm, your mind is busy trying to stay ahead of something that hasn't even happened yet. That is not the life God intended for you to live. He did not design you to carry the burden of every possible outcome. He did not call you to live in a constant state of anticipation and worry. He called you to trust him, not partially, not conditionally, but fully. And that kind of trust cannot coexist with the need to mentally control everything. Because when you are truly walking in faith, you don't have to keep running simulations in your mind. You don't have to prepare for every worst case scenario. You don't have to brace yourself for disappointment before it even arrives. Faith allows you to be present. It allows you to engage with your life as it is, not as your fears imagine it could be. And this doesn't mean you stop being wise. It doesn't mean you abandon planning or responsibility. It means you stop trying to control what only God can handle. It means you do your part and then you release the outcome. It means you trust that even if things don't go according to your plan, they are still unfolding according to his. Because the truth is, your mental rehearsal does not have the power to change your future. It cannot prevent pain. It cannot guarantee success. It cannot control how others behave or how situations unfold. All it can do is keep you mentally occupied, often at the cost of your peace. And peace is not something you stumble into. It is something you choose. It is something you protect. And sometimes protecting your peace means refusing to entertain thoughts that pull you into fear and uncertainty. It means recognizing when your mind is trying to take you down a path of what ifs and choosing instead to ground yourself in what is true. What is true is that God is already aware of what lies ahead. What is true is that He is not surprised by any outcome. What is true is that He is capable of guiding you, sustaining you, and working things out in ways that you could never fully plan for on your own. And if that is true, then you don't have to keep trying to figure everything out in advance. You can surrender. Not in a way that makes you passive, but in a way that makes you peaceful. You can release the constant need to anticipate every possibility and instead trust that God will give you what you need when you need it. You can let go of the pressure to have everything mapped out and instead walk forward one step at a time, knowing that He is directing your path. And as you begin to practice that, something shifts. Your mind becomes quieter. Your thoughts become less chaotic. You find yourself less consumed by what could happen and more anchored in what is happening. You begin to experience moments of stillness that you didn't even realize you were missing, because faith is not about having control. It's about having confidence in the one who does. And when you truly embrace that, you no longer feel the need to rehearse every outcome. You no longer feel the pressure to predict every possibility. You no longer feel like the weight of your future rests on your ability to think it through. Instead, you find yourself resting in a deeper assurance, one that is not based on your understanding, but on your trust. One that allows you to move forward without needing to see the entire path. One that frees you from the exhausting cycle of overthinking and invites you into a life marked by peace, presence, and quiet confidence in God's ability to handle what you cannot control. There is something deeply human about worry. It feels almost automatic, like a reflex your mind has developed to deal with uncertainty. The moment something doesn't make sense, the moment the future feels unclear, the moment you don't have all the answers, your thoughts begin to spiral. You start asking questions you can't yet answer. You start imagining outcomes you can't yet see. And before long, your mind is carrying conversations, scenarios, and fears that haven't even happened. And in those moments, worry feels justified. It feels like you're being responsible, like you're trying to stay ahead, like you're doing your part to make sure things don't fall apart. But what you don't always realize is that worry is not a solution. It's a signal. It's not fixing the situation. It's revealing where your trust is being challenged. Because worry always tries to convince you that everything depends on you. It tells you that if you don't think about it enough, something will go wrong. That if you don't keep revisiting it, you might miss something important. That if you don't stay mentally engaged, you'll lose control. And slowly, without even noticing it, you begin to carry a weight that was never yours to hold. But here is the truth that your worry tries to drown out. What you're worried about, God has already handled. Not in a distant, disconnected way, but in a way that is intentional, precise, and already in motion. Before the problem ever reached your awareness, God had already begun working on the solution. Before you started losing sleep over it, He had already stepped into the situation with clarity, wisdom, and purpose. The challenge is that you don't always see that immediately. You don't always feel that right away. Because your perspective is limited to what is happening now while God is operating across what has been, what is, and what will be. And when your present moment doesn't reflect the outcome you're hoping for, your mind fills in the gap with worry. You start asking, what if this doesn't work out? What if I made the wrong decision? What if everything falls apart? And those questions begin to multiply, feeding your anxiety, making the situation feel heavier than it actually is. And the more you entertain those thoughts, the more real they begin to feel, even though they are not grounded in truth. Because worry has a way of magnifying uncertainty while minimizing faith. It makes the problem feel bigger and God feels smaller, it shifts your focus away from what is possible and anchors you in everything that could go wrong. And without realizing it, you start living as if the outcome depends entirely on your ability to manage it. But if God has already handled it, then your worry is not adding value, it's adding weight. It's not moving the situation forward. It's holding you back. It's not protecting your future. It's stealing your present. And the longer you hold on to it, the heavier it becomes until it begins to affect how you think, how you feel, and how you show up in your life. You find it harder to rest, harder to focus, harder to be present. Even in moments that should feel peaceful, there is an undercurrent of tension that keeps pulling you back into your thoughts. You are physically in one place, but mentally somewhere else, trying to solve something that God has already taken care of. And this is where you have to make a decision, not about the situation, but about your response to it. You have to decide whether you are going to continue carrying something that God has already handled, or if you are going to trust Him enough to release it. Because releasing worry is not about ignoring reality. It's about shifting your perspective. It's about recognizing that just because you don't see the outcome yet doesn't mean it's not already being worked out. It's about choosing to believe that God is active, even when things feel still. That He is moving, even when you can't trace it. That He is aligning things, even when nothing around you seems to be changing. And that kind of trust changes how you live. It allows you to breathe again. It allows you to step out of the constant cycle of what if and step into a place of even if it doesn't happen the way you expected, God is still in control. Even if the timing is different than you planned, God is still working. Even if the path looks unclear, God is still guiding you. Because your peace is not supposed to be dependent on your circumstances. It's supposed to be rooted in your trust. And when you truly trust that God has already handled what concerns you, you no longer feel the need to carry it in your mind. That doesn't mean the thoughts won't come. It doesn't mean the questions won't arise. But it does mean that you don't have to dwell there. You don't have to entertain every fear. You don't have to give your worry permission to stay. You can acknowledge it and then release it. You can feel the uncertainty and still choose to trust. You can recognize